All right, this is Tony Sweet and Captain Ron. Truth be told, we are back. We're excited to have everybody here with us, and we have a great show for you guys today. We have Dr. Jeffrey Long, who is a near-death experience researcher and a New York Times best-selling author. I'm so excited to have him on the show. He is also the founder of the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, and so please, let's just welcome him. We have so much to ask him. I know people are excited about this. Dr. Jeffrey Long.
For that kind introduction. Glad to be here.
Thank you, sir, for being here.
He's on Skype. He can't see our live studio audience, Tony. So.
That's right. That's right. We have a big studio audience for you.
Okay.
Well, Captain Ron, go ahead and you got some good questions.
Well, let's just jump off, Doc, if you don't mind. Why don't you explain to our audience what an actual near-death experience is and how that may differ from other phenomenon like out-of-body experiences and whatnot?
Absolutely. Good question. A near-death experience, as the name implies, means you're near death. You're so physically compromised at that time that you're unconscious and may be clinically dead with an absent heartbeat, absent breathing. You're so physically compromised at that near-death point, if you don't get better, you're going to suffer permanent, irreversible death. Now, at that time, when you're unconscious and a lucid, organized memory at that time should be impossible, it happens. That's the experience part of a near-death experience. And while no two near-death experiences are the same, and I should know, I've studied over 4,000,
wow.
The experience elements are very consistently observed and typically in very consistent order, and that's a phenomenon we all know today as near-death experience.
Now, with near-death experience, did you have your own experience, the reason you got into this research and the study?
Yeah, great question. I was actually going through a medical journal, one of the Journal of the American Medical Association, one of the most prestigious medical journals decades ago. Quite by accident, found an article that had the term near-death experience in it, which I'd never heard before. Fascinated, I stopped, read it, and was astounded. Here were people all around the world having these experiences when they were dead clinically, and absolutely everything I knew from my medical training said, it's impossible. You can't have this kind of lucid, organized, consistently observed experience, and yet they were. That got my interest. I mean, gosh, how can one not be fascinated about wondering what happens when we die? So I've started, even broke off from looking at that cancer for my cancer-related article, started reading the references about near-death experience, was fascinated, and then several years later, when I heard my first in-person near-death experience shared by another person, I was hooked. I set up my research website, Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, and started gathering the largest number of publicly accessible near-death experiences on the planet. And that's what I used for my research.
I know this is not just a phenomenon of late, because, you know, they didn't really start talking about near-death experience, you know, with the books and history channels and, you know, all the TV shows about it now. When was, if you know, I'm looked it up a little bit, the first known, I guess, research of near-death experience?
Right. The first near-death experience that seems plausible was reported at the time of Plato. A soldier named Ur died. He was on a funeral pyre ready to be burned, as was the custom then, miraculously recovered and recounted an amazing near-death experience. Now, the first published series that used the term near-death experience that had over 60 near-death experiences was 1975, or Dr. Raymond Moody. He coined the term, got the public fascinated with the phenomenon, and that started the research back in 1975.
Now, what about some of these cases that, why don't you tell us some of the stronger cases that are hard to refute, how these people like rise above their body, and then I've heard how they can see things on top of lockers that are 12 feet in the air that you couldn't see unless you rose up, stuff like that. Isn't there some strong cases?
Okay, let's talk about Vicky. Vicky was born totally blind. To her, vision was unknown and unknowable for her whole life. In her early 20s, she was involved in a car accident. No, she wasn't driving. She was had someone else drive her home from a bar where she was a singer. She had a great voice. But bad auto accident, and she had her, and she was severely injured. Her consciousness rose above her body, and for the first time in her life, she had vision. She had vision. She could see front of her, behind of her, right, left, up, down. It's called 360-degree vision, and that's not unusual in near-death experiences. She went on to have a life review, very detailed, classic near-death experience, but with vision that she'd never known in her life. So when she came back and recounted that, we had the first born from birth, totally blind person who had a stunningly visual near-death experience. There is, I can assure you, as a physician, absolutely no medical explanation for that possibility.
So why do you think some people have such a, like her, such a visual, especially if somebody couldn't see, to where some people said, I just saw the light and that was it. And I didn't see any people. I didn't have any experiences other than the light. Why do you feel like some go deeper than others?
Right. Good question. There was a very, very detailed near-death experience I reviewed, and it was so detailed and so blissful. This person asked in the depth of their near-death experience, literally asked the being that was with them that they thought was God, why me? Why am I so special that this happened to me? And I think the answer was, if you will, the Rosetta Stone of helping to understand near-death experiences. And the answer was, love falls on everyone equally. This is what you needed to live your life. And I think that has a lot to do with it. I think it's not just a matter of the near-death experiencer's background, their demographics. These seem to be co-created experiences. There seems to be some greater, higher, mammoth intelligence that's a part of this. They often describe being with other beings, acceleration of consciousness. So I'm reasonably convinced that there seems to be some deeper meaning. People have near-death experiences because they need their near-death experiences. They have deeper near-death experiences because, as was literally shared with that person who had a near-death experience, this is what you needed to live your earthly life.
Well, this brings us right to what I want to get at is there a typical near-death experience? Do people have the same experience, or are they completely different? I mean, it would seem stronger if it's the same experience.
Yeah, no two near-death experiences are the same, and that's important, but there are some very consistently observed, what we call elements, or if you will, the content of typical near-death experiences. In brief, a typical if you will, detailed near-death experience that follows that pattern would have that life-threatening event. They're unconscious, they may be clinically dead. At that time, there's an out-of-body experience. Consciousness rises above their body, typically above their body where they can see and often hear ongoing earthly events, which may include frantic efforts at their own resuscitation by others. They may pass into or through a tunnel. Often at the end of the tunnel, there's a beautiful, mystical light, unlike any light they've seen on earth. At that time, they may have a life review where they see all or a part of their prior life. They may encounter deceased loved ones, joyous reunions, even pets. They may be in unearthly, beautiful landscapes. It's easy to understand why they're called heavenly realms. And then at that point in time, they may need to make a decision about whether to return to their earthly life with the help of the presence of other people there. And then when they recover from what nearly killed them, and they're ready to share that typical detailed near-death experience in brief there.
Tony, I think your grandfather had an experience like this. It seems like it hit everything the doc just mentioned.
Yeah, and in fact, it was back in the 60s before I was even born, like probably 65. My grandfather was ill. He went to the hospital. He died, in the hospital. He said, and he was a minister and, businessman. And so back then it was kind of odd when you talk about this stuff. But he said he saw the light. He went through the light. He came out in an open field. He saw his mother across the river. And she said, it's not your time. You need to go back. And then he said, as soon as she said that, my grandmother, who was still alive, he heard her voice say, Floyd, come back. And he said, then he woke back up in the hospital. So that leads me to a question. Why do some people not have a choice to come back and some people do?
Yeah, and again, there's no good answer for that. And the most honest response is, no one on the planet really knows for sure. Mm-hmm. But again, if there's one thing I'm convinced about, is that there seems to be that higher loving presence of consciousness that, if you will create a near-death experience for those that need it, and perhaps not so much for those where it's not critical to live their earthly life. And by the way, thanks for sharing that near-death experience. That's classic. including right down to the concept of it's not your time, as I've heard literally hundreds of times from other people that have had a near-death experience.
And he lived about another 15 years. He was 79. And when he went to the hospital, he said, I'm not coming back. He knew it. He says, I'm not coming back, so you be a good boy. I was like 12 years old. He said, be a good boy. But he was not scared at all.
Yeah. And that's not a surprise. When you have a near-death experience, virtually everybody loses their fear of death. That's not hard to understand, is it? From their perspective, they know what's going to happen when they die. There's a beautiful, wonderful afterlife. Obviously, it's joyous. It's even something to look into. But very, very few near-death experiencers retain much of a fear of death. Now, they may fear dying. That's common. But as far as what happens next, after that veil of death is gone beyond, they know that there's that wonderful life. It's their destiny, their heritage, nothing to be afraid of.
Now, how does God play into this? Does everybody based on their religion when they're growing up? Does it tend to reflect their experience of an NDE?
Yeah, that's what I thought. Good question. My more recent book, God and the Afterlife, investigated people during near-death experiences who, during that time, right in the middle of their near-death experience, either encountered or aware of God. And, for 277, that's a large study. Mm-hmm. There was striking consistency in how they described of God, and it was absolutely not related to their prior religious belief, as defined as conservative, fundamentalist, or moderate, or liberal. And so those religious, self-proclaimed religious designations that the near-death experiencers provided had nothing to do with their probability of encountering God. In fact, we have a small series of people who were atheists at the time of their near-death experience who encountered God. What is consistently described, of course, they didn't remain atheists after that, but among that vast number, hundreds of people literally, that encountered God, very striking consistency in what they encounter. God is described as overwhelmingly lovingly, overwhelmingly compassionate, variably described in appearance, most typically of light, unearthly, beautiful, mystical light, non-judgmental, does not seem to judge them in any way, which I find reassuring, but also very much, they felt very much connected to this person, literally a unity, a mystical connection that they had not known their entire life. Often a very dramatic thing that they describe with God comes back as a very beautiful descriptors by so many people. Again, God, nothing to be feared. God seems to be that's embraced and here for each and every one of us in our earthly life. It's really dramatically enhanced my understanding of God to study these types of near-death experiences. God seems to be very much on our side and a very loving, compassionate person for each and every one of us.
It's interesting. It's very interesting to me that you said that there's hundreds of cases where atheists come back and they've completely changed to now a belief in God. It's interesting that they would even define it as God.
Yeah, I want to clarify, it's not hundreds of atheists, it's hundreds of people overall that had near-death experiences that described God. The subset of those 277 I studied that were atheist was like around 8 or 10. And of those people that self-described themselves as atheist at the time of their near-death experience that went on to encounter God, very typical, same descriptors of God. Their atheistic beliefs, interestingly, were not an issue of discussion when they were during their near-death experience. They just simply encountered that same loving, compassionate being that they described as God in their descriptor of their own near-death experience. And as I said, they were no longer atheists after having personally experienced God and knowing that God's for real.
I'm going to ask you about Edgar Cayce.
Mm-hmm.
He was known for multiple near-death experiences, and he could actually leave his body at will. Is that considered a near-death experience? Because I would say, an accident, illness, but if somebody could just leave their body and experience the same thing at will, can you explain the difference between the two, and how was he able to do that? I mean, you may not know, of course, but I'm just curious.
I'm actually there. Edgar Cayce, the organization that developed from his teachings is called the Association for Research and Enlightenment. I'm actually a member, and I've talked at their meetings, so I have some knowledge of this. Edgar Cayce seemed to be one of those gifted individuals that could have induced, if you will, out-of-body experiences or consciousness separate from their body. Now, he was not having a life-threatening event at that time.
Right.
He was fully conscious and lucid actually to the point that he was working on trying to separate his consciousness at times, or times that can occur spontaneously. Now, with the near-death experience, that separation of consciousness, that out-of-body experience, occurs only at the moment that physically you're unconscious, that you don't have any consciousness left. You're so physically compromised from that close brush with death that you couldn't possibly have any memory, and yet you do, the near-death experience. So those are two separate things. When you have separation of consciousness, we call them out-of-body experience if they're not associated with a life-threatening event, and near-death experience if it happens at the time that you nearly die. I actually have a whole website devoted to this, by the way, these out-of-body experiences without a life-threatening event, called the Out-of-Body Experience Research Foundation. So we've literally studied thousands of these types of experiences of out-of-body experience not associated with being near death.
And how many people like Daniel Brinkley, who has had multiple because of a lightning strike or a surgery, have you studied multiple, or people that had multiple, and are they always the same? Why do you think they have to have multiple?
That's a good question. Out of the over 4,000 near-death experiences that I've studied from my research website, there's, I'm going to guess, certainly over 100, maybe as many as 200 of people that describe multiple near-death experiences. They have multiple life-threatening events, either because of a recurring medical condition like a seizure disorder or sleep apnea or some other things that could cause life-threatening events repeatedly, or they're just very unlucky, shall we say, life-threatening events of different types. Now, it's been very interesting to me to see how they describe their near-death experiences when they've had two or more. And there's really no consistent pattern to that. Some of them seem to have very consistent patterns. It's the same type of thing, same out-of-body experience, same tunnel, same unearthly realm. So there seems to be, as they have multiple near-death experiences, often a progression further and further along a typical detailed near-death experience. But other people, about half, will have near-death experiences that seem very different from each other. There's no clear consistency in pattern. It's not like they're going on a progression. They're just simply having two significantly different components of their near-death experience. And again, from what I've seen of these, again, over 100, I can't tell exactly why some people have these two different patterns when they have multiple experiences.
Doc, you bring me right to my hard question, which is, could this be something else besides consciousness going on after death? Could it be a way that the body prepares itself to die, like a dream state, like a way that we peacefully pass on?
Okay. The alternative, or if you will, skeptical explanations have literally been explored for over 40 years now. In my experience, I've heard just about every physiological, cultural, or psychological explanation for near-death experience that you conceive of. Now, there's been over 20 of these skeptical near-death experience causes that have been proposed over the decades. And the reason there's over 20 and so many of them is very simple. There's no one or several of these skeptical, physiological, or whatever explanations that make sense even to the skeptics themselves. I mean, think about it. If there was any explanation that made sense, you wouldn't need over 20 of these different explanations floating around. But the bottom line is, and I've discussed people that are proponents of these alternatives, I've debated in some prominent media events. By the way, I've never lost a debate when I've done that. But the bottom line is, from having looked at it that carefully, there's no one or several explanations of near-death experience that can explain any of these elements of near-death experience, let alone the totality of all that occurs during a near-death experience. Near-death experiences really are medically inexplicable. And if you have any doubt of that, please understand that typical near-death experiences can occur under general anesthesia. And under that blanket of sleep, you should have no possibility of a remembrance at all. Yet when you're under adequate general anesthesia and your heart stops, don't forget it's very carefully measured during surgery, and people can have these typical near-death experiences, out-of-body experience. I've compared the two groups, NDEs under anesthesia and under all other circumstances, and they're really essentially identical in terms of the elements that occur. So if the general anesthesia that completely shuts down the brain, if you can have a near-death experience at that time, and by the scores people have reported them to me, that almost single-handedly proves that near-death experiences absolutely cannot be due to any physical brain function as we understand it whatsoever.
Okay, so if you're ruling out all these skeptical alternatives to what this could be, what proof do you have that it is in fact consciousness going on? What do we have to the strongest evidence we have that consciousness lives beyond?
Yeah, some of the strongest evidence that consciousness can go apart from the body is exactly the question I asked in my research, and that is, when you're unconscious or clinically dead and your consciousness goes up above your body, what are you seeing? Where, especially if it's far from your physical body and far from any possible physical sensory awareness, is that observation accurate? And the answer, once again, by the hundreds of people, over thousands of people that have had these out-of-body observations, and including the many, many hundreds that made these out-of-body observations very far from their physical body, far from anything that they could see, hear, feel at all. And let's not forget they're unconscious anyway. When they make these out-of-body observations, when they go back and check out what they see and heard, over 95% of the time it is accurate down to the finest detail. It is impossible for them to come away with that sensory awareness far away, I mean like even miles away from their physical body, unless it is exactly as a near-death experience has understood their experience, a real out-of-body experience with a real observation of far distant events that was absolutely, you almost hate to use the term, but dead accurate.
Well, scientifically, I mean, you're giving us a lot of great information, but just as a man, why do you think so many people are given the second chance? I know we said we really don't know, but and then they come back and their lives are changed. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like there is a God or an entity or beings that are trying to grow our soul? Or I mean, I'm trying, because a lot of people that come down, I don't know anybody that didn't come back and they didn't change. Why do you feel that they changed their ways, their religion, their thoughts, their thinking?
Right. Yeah, good question. Certainly when you have a dramatic, detailed near-death experience, how can it not change anything? I mean, you have this understanding that there's life after death, a wonderful afterlife. You may come back of this awareness that we're all one, we're all in this together. Right. They commonly have a strong sense of unity. They believe that there's, there's a God, an entity that is overwhelmingly loving, compassionate, and that, that we're all in this together. Mm-hmm. There seems to be that connection of all of us on this earth and all of us that have ever lived. So to have that kind of detailed understanding really transcends, for most people, what they previously believed, and it helps them to be, and the typical changes are called after effects in the scholarly literature. They become more loving, more compassionate to other people, typically lack of fear of death, typically, of course, increased belief in an afterlife, increased belief in God, obviously. And these people tend to be living their life, if you will, more confidently, more lovingly, and less afraid. Sometimes this can result in tremendous growth. They may change jobs if they're in a job where they can't express their new values. They may leave relationships if they're in an unloving relationship and they now value loving relationships. So changes are very, very important to people. And you don't change your life that dramatically unless you've had an experience that with every fiber of your being is real. And that's true of near-death experiencers.
All right, so we've heard all the good stuff. We've heard the people that have had a near-death experience. They've changed their life. They came back and it was a great experience. But every so often you hear about the ones that say, I went to hell. I saw darkness. I saw evil. I saw... How many of the 4,000 that you did research on were negative?
Okay. Yeah, in the scholarly literature, we call them distressful because negative is a pejorative or judgmental term.
Right.
And as we're about to discover real quickly, they're not necessarily all negative. When I did my study on these frightening, and I used what was be considered objectively frightening. I mean, some people are subjectively frightening NDEs. I recall one vivid example where they coded in the ambulance rushing them to the hospital after their heart attack. Their consciousness, out-of-body experience, was over the ambulance and angels appeared. But they were frightened and they were batting at the angels. So that's a frightening experience. But I think most people would say, well, that's who knows what their emotional state was at. But the truly objective frightening experiences are where they encounter hellish realm, frightening beings, frightening realms, noises, sensations, smells. I mean, things that are typically considered to be extremely unpleasant, even hellish. Now, in studying that, you have to be careful because dying can be a frightening experience. And so if you're not careful to sort out near-death experiences from hallucinatory, say, intensive care unit experiences, you can be misled. But aware of that, as I am as a physician and near-death experience researcher, I found only about 1% to 2% of my near-death experiences actually had hellish content. There's a couple different types of that. They may observe a hellish realm from a distance. That's about half. They may be with another spiritual being and be aware of some segregated part of this unearthly realm they're in, where they're aware of there's darkness and evil, and they may be told you don't want to go there, and believe me, they don't. But they know that that's a part of, if you will, the heavenly realm, and that seems to be hell. The other half are actually in hell. They experience that, they go through it, and obviously that can be extremely distressing to the people that do that. Now, it's important to remember, even among those that have faced a darkness unimaginable to virtually any of us that have ever walked on the planet Earth with this type of hellish experience, many of them come back and say, you know, my life changed. And they often have after effects, changes in their lives that are very similar to people that had pleasant near-death experiences. And many of them come back and say, I needed that. I needed that experience to really confront some things about myself and to make those changes that were so necessary for me to live my earthly life in the way that it should be lived. So there's a silver lining, even seemingly to the most dark of human experiences. And I think that's sort of the mystery and the wonder, and interestingly, the promise of hellish near-death experiences. And I would emphasize that even among those that have had near-death experiences, and in my extensive study of those, I am convinced there's not a permanent involuntary hell. I think the beings that got there made a whole series of very poor choices, probably closer and closer to ego-driven, unloving choices, and ultimately they ended up surrounded by beings that were like themselves, unloving, the demonic. That's why they're there. They have a choice, and that's their comfort level. That's where they want to be. I think people, even in the darkest realms, in the after they've gone, after they've died, even in these hellish realms, have the choice to make the decision that they want to return to the light, to love, and to where essentially all other spiritual beings are. So again, to emphasize, in an overwhelming, loving, compassionate God that seems to oversee this universe, in a universe ruled by love, I'm convinced there's no permanent involuntary hell.
Whew, thank God.
I know.
Thank goodness there's a lot.
Hey, going back to that,
it's interesting to do those kind of researches, but certainly there is that it's like these hellish beings on the other side in the hellish realm. It seems to be a type of overwhelming spiritual sickness. I mean, these are people that have made a variety of spiritual errors, but the overwhelming, encompassing, and embracing and forgiving loveness of everything that I've come in near-death experiences to understand about God and what exists in the afterlife suggests that is our destiny, that loving, beautiful, peaceful serenity truly called heaven, that's our destiny for anybody anywhere on the planet that so chooses that when they die.
Doc, it seems like you focus on researching these cases and interviewing these people and having them fill out questionnaires and studying the data that way. I've seen now that this is growing where these guys like Dr. Sam Parnia in NYU, the awareness study, where they're trying to purposely set up operation rooms and stuff where the patient could only see these objects in that room or only hear this audio that they do during surgeries in case they have an NDE. And then when they do have an NDE, he has that data to kind of strengthen the case that this did happen. What is your take on those type of studies?
Yeah, the targets are typically visual. I'm not sure they're doing so-called audio targets at this point in time. But what they do is the research methodology is to get typically a target, a picture of something that has a unique shape, color, and pattern to it, if you will, that is placed in the operating room, emergency room, somewhere where there's some chance of there being a life-threatening event. And in the I love Dr. Parnia's research. It is extremely important. However, also a doctor, and I can assure you, in this modern healthcare environment, the probability of you working with a hospital and getting the hospital administration, hospital nurses, and other doctors on board on placing targets in the emergency room and operating room is extremely difficult. They don't want anything to do with that. They consider it extra work, a burden. It is extremely difficult to do studies like that, and that makes Dr. Parnia's work all the more impressive and pioneering. Now, he's working with a lot of places, hospitals, particular settings, and he's an intensive care unit doctor, so goodness knows he's had a few patients in environments where there's life-threatening events all the time. In the targets they've placed, nobody yet has seen a target, but understand the targets are typically placed way to the side of the room. They have to get the hospital administration to buy into it. And when you have an out-of-body experience, your consciousness goes above your body, and you see your physical body down below. Where are you going to look? Are you going to look over to the side of the room at a little target there? Nope. You're going to look down, right down where the action is. The resuscitation efforts, people frantically trying to bring you back to life, that's sound, action, motion. And so it's not surprising to me that nobody spotted those targets. What is impressive to me is I guess it would now be hundreds and hundreds of people that describe with vivid accuracy what's going on around them during their own resuscitation, during their own near-death experience. Over 95% of the time, extremely accurate down to the fine details. So I'm convinced by overwhelming evidence, as far as placing a visual target off to the side of the room and having someone see it, I think that's great, but I don't think that's necessary to accept the reality of near-death experience at all.
Do you think, because once we cross over, time is,
meaningless.
Yeah, meaningless. So do people feel like they're there for a short amount of time, or do they feel like they're there for a longer period of time? Of course, here on Earth, you can't be dead for very long, or you're brain dead. So, what is that? Is it they feel like it's a short time or long time or longer periods of time?
Great question. It shows the substantial difference in these unearthly, if you will, heavenly realms from earthly realms. In these unearthly heavenly realms, almost uniformly, people having near-death experiences say there is no time. Time literally does not exist as we know it on Earth, and they can have extremely detailed events that in earthly time would be hours or even days in exceptional near-death experiences, while they were unconscious or clinically dead for what would be measured in minutes in earthly time. Not at all unusual. Also in the afterlife, in addition to there being an absence of time, it's almost uniformly described. Communication is non-physical. It's virtually always described as telepathic, but not just understanding what the other person says. It's understanding their feelings, emotions, context. It's a depth of communication we literally can't know in our earthly life. So there's some substantial differences on the unearthly heavenly realms from earthly life. To me, that makes them even more realistic. I mean, if you've gone through your earthly life and never known at any time during your life an absence of time, and yet you almost uniformly have near-death experiencers saying during that near-death experience there was no time, to me that's further powerful, strong evidence for the reality of near-death experiences. I mean, how else would you conceive of no time in your earthly life.
Quality. You know what is also interesting about what you're saying there is that same thing is when we had like Richard Martini in here, and he talked about, he does the past life regressions with people and mediums and things, and they said no time. That didn't happen. I wonder if any of these NDE experiencers have done that sort of thing where they did a past life regression or tried to contact somebody through a medium on the other side. Now that they've been there, I wonder if they've done that and tried to talk to someone on the other side.
Yeah, it's not at all unusual for people in general, to try to communicate with mediums. One thing we do ask as a critical survey question is, has any event in your life reproduced any aspect of the near-death experience? And again, off the top of my head, I can't recall that there's any significant predisposition of mediums or any other, thing that people do that reproduces any element of the near-death experience as past life regressions. The two things that pop up, prayer, meditation. Meditation seems to produce some sense of the feeling, and really the only thing that really consistently reproduces a near-death experience is another near-death experience, and that they seem to be that unearthly in their elements. By the way, for your interested listeners, if you want to try to understand how time is not relevant in near-death experience, take the classic Einstein equation, E equals mc squared. E is energy, m is mass, t is time, or c is distance. I mean, c is the speed of light. C is speed of light is d divided by t, distance divided by time. Solve that equation for t like I have, and you'll see how in an environment where there's essentially no mass and essentially all energy, time approaches zero by pure mathematics. Interesting. So Einstein may have, in a way, in his equation, have helped understand that in an unearthly realm where there's no physical mass and the realm is essentially energy, that would explain purely by Einstein's equation that time approaches zero.
Did you get that, Tony?
I wrote it down.
Yeah, solve it. That'll be your homework.
Tony's head spun around for a second there. I don't know if that was on camera or not, but
well, that's just a habit I do.
Yeah, we gotta watch that head spinning. We were talking about hellish NDEs.
No, this is really interesting stuff, and I believe with a lot of people out there. I was telling Ron that there's a lot of people that don't disclose that they've had near-death experiences, and I think the more as we move forward, it's kind of like the UFOs. People are abductees. They don't ever talk about it.
It's a very similar thing in that regard.
Yeah. So, do you feel that abductees and near-death experience have similar aspects to it?
Yeah, that's a good question. UFO abductees is so outside of my area of research and scholarly understanding, I can't really comment on that. I rarely have people that share their near-death experiences that say they were abductees, very rarely. So I can't really correlate that with near-death experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, yeah.
Well, it's like, even like DMT and these other kind of psychedelic things too are similar, right, Doc?
DMT is one of the psychoactive drugs. I'm actually in contact with one of the major researchers on that, studying the effects on that. That's an interesting concept. We have a number of people that have shared with my website over the years as part of their survey that they took psychoactive drugs such as DMT and that it really didn't seem to be like their near-death experience. On the other hand, there are some people that have reported some DMT experiences that seem similar. Big cautionary note here. People that take DMT or other illicit drugs illegally are extremely unreliable in their reporting of their experience. So I would only trust what's been published in the scholarly literature. People using these substances under very controlled scientific circumstances with all the appropriate cautions and the advance approval of research organizations. Those are the experiences I believe. I still don't think that they're at all like near-death experiences, but I would also hasten to say that research is ongoing, and we may learn more in the future that may give us a different perspective on that.
That's awesome. Well put. Do you have a sense of what percentage of people have these? The fact that doctor's studying or setting up things in hospitals because it happens often enough that he could get some data. tells me that it must happen somewhat frequently. Do we have any idea what percentage of people have a near-death experience?
Yeah, Sam, Dr. Parnia, in his most recent research, thought it was a lot less than we had thought it was. Maybe only 1% or 2% of people having cardiac arrests reported a near-death experience in his study. That was different from other prospective studies that estimated it was in the range of 9 to 18%. So currently, the best scholarly literature says only about 1 to 18% of those that have that close brush with death will have a near-death experience. So that seems to be what's going. There's no demographic or any other correlate that we can predict who will have a near-death experience. Again, I think it's back to what we discussed earlier. It seems to be that, co-created experience and what you need to live your earthly life. For those people that need it, they'll have it.
Well, we only have just a few more minutes left, and I know a lot of people may have questions. Do you ever go and do workshops or speak so people can ask you face to face? Because we're just us, and so but our listeners, I know they may want to reach out to you. So how do yeah.
Yeah, I answer essentially all emails that need answered when they're sent to my Near-Death Experience Research Foundation website, NDERF at nderf.org. I consider that important public outreach. I answer emails. I've had some fascinating discussions come up with some people. So that's part of what we do literally as a public service. As far as speaking tours, I can. I'm a phenomenally busy doctor. I'm typically working well into the weekends. So at this point in my life, it is literally impossible for me to go on a tour. I'm just that busy of a medical doctor at this point in time.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, and I'm sure our audience is going to really appreciate it too.
Yeah.
I did have another question for you, though.
Great questions.
Oh, thank you.
Well, from Tony, at least. I did want to ask you another question about the experience that these people have. I've heard of a case where a woman was in a canoe and she was trapped underwater for 30 minutes, and she somehow survived this experience. And that when she had her NDE, she actually got a prophecy that when her son turned 18 that he would die and this would be okay. And when he grew up and turned 18, he was fine, and then sure enough, 6 months later, he died. And this had a profound effect on her life. Do you see a lot of times when people have a prophecy like that, or is it typically just go back, it's not your time?
Yeah, we actually have a specific survey directed toward future visions or awarenesses of what may occur in the future. That's an interesting topic. Sometimes they're almost universally true, such as if they become aware for younger people, the number of children and what their genders will be in the future. I haven't seen that be wrong yet, which is astounding when they have these near-death experiences in childhood. As far as prophecies like that of a death of a son, that's rare. They do happen, and I would emphasize that, and I don't doubt that for a minute. They're just very, very rare. That's not a typical pattern in near-death experiences at all. As far as having a future prophecy not come true, especially when it involves a family member, I have yet to encounter that. So they seem to come true. They seem to be most accurate when they're related to that individual or direct loved ones in their family. And that's sort of yet another of the myriad of lines of evidence that have convinced me these near-death experiences are, in a word, real.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I just said it is funny that I've seen multiple people after a near-death experience become very intuitive, psychic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, many.
That's interesting.
Many.
It's another aspect, Doc. If you feel that this is real, you've been studying it for over 20 years now. Do you feel this is getting the attention it deserves? You think this would be like on the front page and the headline of CNN? It doesn't seem like a lot of people don't even know what an NDE is.
Yeah, no question about that. It is so outside of what's conventionally believed by a lot of people that it's difficult to accept that. Now, we've asked people that had near-death experiences what they believe about the reality of their experience. Over 95% responded on the survey, definitely real, out of 1,122 people surveyed that we asked that question to. There's no question a near-death experience eliminates near-death experience disbelief. But for the general public, the great majority that haven't had that, it is astounding that there's almost no research funding for this, almost no publicly supported research. I do all this personally without any funding at all. And that's true for the great majority of near-death experience researchers. And given the implications of what near-death experiences teach and how that affects both the individual and society as a whole, I continue, even after 20 years, astounded there's not more interest in research in near-death.
And that's something that really is amazing that there's not. Well, we're glad that you're out there doing this, because I think this research is going to lead to something valuable, certainly.
Oh, please, yes. And we thank you for being here. And make sure you go to his website. It's nderf.org, and check out his website. If I'm curious to hear people's stories, so
they have them on the website, right, Doc?
Yeah.
Like most of these cases are on there.
Yeah, when I say we have over 4,000 near-death experiences, we have over 4,000 posted on the website. It's by far the largest publicly accessible website collection of near-death experiences in the world.
Awesome.
All right, last thing, and then we got to get out of here. But what is the most experience or story you've heard from somebody that just really blew your mind, where you're like, this is almost unbelievable, but I believe it?
Yeah. What's almost
Good
unbelievable is that they are so consistently observant. Go to that website you mentioned, nderf.org, and go under the link to exceptional experiences. These are the most amazing detailed NDEs in the world, and there are so many of them, they almost blow even after 20 years of research, they almost blow my socks off with how detailed they are and the profound implications for every single person on this planet about some of the deeper big questions all of humanity is asked. That's right there, right on the website.
Perfect.
Awesome. Thanks,
Well,
Doc.
thank you so much for being on Truth Be Told. I know Captain Ron and I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Our listeners do also. You can check out all our videos, but this one especially is going up on our YouTube channel. And please go to our website, truthbetoldworldwide.com. We appreciate everybody for tuning in, and everybody for supporting us, and the people like Dr. Long here. It's fascinating. Like I said, we're not the experts, but we have people like yourself that we learn every single time. So thank you so much for being here.
Great show. Really appreciate it. Thank you all.
You got it. All right, everybody. We'll see you next time on Truth Be Told.